The notification from the bank's fraud department didn't come as a text, but as a cold clinical phone call at 3 in the morning, informing me that my primary savings account had been drained to a balance of exactly $0 while I slept. What the banker on the other end of the line didn't know was that the person who had signed the digital transfer wasn't some anonymous hacker in a distant country. It was my husband of 7 years, Mark, a man who hadn't stepped foot in our home for 48 months. He had left me to play maid, nurse, and sole provider to his aging parents, while he apparently decided that my life's work was now his personal slush fund. As I sat there in the dark, the blue light of my phone illuminating the cracks in the ceiling of the house I had paid for, the silence of the guest room where his mother slept was more deafening than the news of my empty bank account. 5 years ago, life didn't feel like a ticking time bomb. It felt like a garden in early spring. Mark and I had just bought the old Miller estate, a crumbling but magnificent Victorian on the edge of town that everyone else was too afraid to touch. I was a senior architectural consultant, and that house was my masterpiece. I spent my weekends stripped to my waist in sawdust, the smell of aged cedar and fresh plaster clinging to my skin. Mark was the visionary, or so he called himself, pacing the original hardwood floors and talking about the grand dinner parties we would host once the wraparound porch was finished. He had this way of speaking, soft, melodic, persuasive, that made even his most impulsive ideas sound like divine inspiration. I loved him for it. I loved the way the sunset hit the stained glass we restored together, casting shards of ruby and sapphire light across our living room rug. We were a team, or at least, that was the story I told myself every time I covered the mortgage while he transitioned between high-end consulting gigs. The first crack in the foundation wasn't in the house, but in a phone call Mark received during our third winter there. His father, Victor, had suffered a minor stroke, and his mother, Elena, was spiraling into a panic. They lived 3 states away in a cramped rented apartment that smelled of mothballs and resentment. Mark came to me that night, his eyes shining with a vulnerability that always made my heart ache. We were sitting in the kitchen, the air smelling of the rosemary chicken I'd just roasted. "Sarah, I can't leave them there," he whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he held his wine glass. "My mother is falling apart. If they stay in that place, they'll wither away. We have so much room here. This house, it was meant for family, wasn't it?" I looked around at the expansive kitchen, the custom marble countertops I'd saved for 3 years to afford, and the breakfast nook that caught the morning sun perfectly. I thought about my own parents who had passed away years ago and how much I missed the noise of a full house. "Of course," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "They can stay in the West Wing. It's private. They'll have their own space. It'll be temporary just until Victor is back on his feet." "Temporary," Mark echoed, his voice filled with relief. "Just a few months. Thank you, Sarah. You're the anchor of this family." Elena and Victor arrived 2 weeks later with enough luggage to suggest a permanent migration. Elena was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper opinions. From the moment she stepped onto the porch I had painstakingly sanded, she didn't comment on the architecture or the view. Instead, she ran a finger over the railing and tutted. "A bit drafty, isn't it? And all these stairs. Victor's knees won't like this at all, Mark." Mark just laughed it off, kissing her cheek. "You'll get used to it, Mom. Sarah has worked wonders here." The first few months were a blur of adjustments. The house no longer smelled of my expensive candles or fresh-baked bread. It smelled of Elena's heavy cabbage stews and the medicinal liniment Victor used for his joints. My morning ritual of drinking coffee in silence was replaced by Elena's constant commentary on my career. "Do you really need to work such long hours, Sarah? A house like this needs a woman's touch during the day. The dust is settling on the baseboards." I bit my tongue. I was the one paying for the woman's touch, to be applied by a professional cleaning service twice a month, but I didn't want to cause friction. I wanted Mark to be happy, and he was. He seemed lighter, more energized. So when he told me, only 6 months after his parents moved in, that he had been scouted for a once-in-a-lifetime project management role in London, I wanted to be the supportive wife. "It's a 2-year contract, Sarah," he said, pacing our bedroom. "The pay is triple what I can make here. We can pay off the house, set up a trust for my parents, and finally start that travel fund we talked about. It's the breakthrough we've been waiting for." 2 years? I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What about your parents? They're just getting settled. I can't manage this house and them all by myself, Mark. My job is demanding." He wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my hair. "They love you, Sarah. And it's not like I'm going to the moon. I'll be back for holidays, for long weekends. We'll FaceTime every night. Besides, you're the strongest person I know. You've got this." He left on a rainy Tuesday in October. I remember the way the tires of the Uber hissed against the wet pavement as he drove away. I stood on that porch, the one Elena hated, and felt a strange, fleeting premonition. It wasn't a sense of loss, but a sense of being trapped. I turned back into the house, and there stood Elena at the end of the hallway, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the foyer as if she were appraising a hotel she intended to take over. "Well," she said, her voice devoid of the warmth she used with Mark, "since he's gone, we should talk about the grocery budget. Victor needs a very specific diet, and I noticed you've been buying the cheap olive oil. It simply won't do." That was the beginning of the long wait. 2 years turned into 3. 3 years turned into 4. Mark's breaks between project phases became longer, but his visits home became shorter, then vanished entirely. There was always an excuse, a deadline, a flight cancellation, a sudden meeting in Singapore or Zurich. He was a ghost who lived in my phone, a handsome face on a screen who blew me kisses and told me how much he missed me, while his mother's voice became the soundtrack of my daily misery. I was working 60 hours a week to keep up with the rising costs of the estate. The property taxes had jumped, the roof needed a specialized repair that cost a fortune, and Elena's specific diet and medical needs seemed to double every month. Mark sent money, or so he said, into our joint savings account, the one we had set up for the house. I never checked it closely. I was too tired, too burnt out from managing architectural bids by day and Victor's physical therapy appointments by night. I trusted my husband. I trusted the man who had promised we were a team. But that night, as I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the zero balance notification, the veil didn't just slip, it was incinerated. I went to my desk and opened my laptop, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely type the password. I went back through the statements for the last year. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic thud that felt like a warning. Mark hadn't been depositing his salary into the joint account for months. He had been withdrawing. $5,000 here, $3,000 there, and the biggest blow, the $20,000 taken out yesterday, had a memo attached to it in the internal banking notes. It wasn't for medical bills or house repairs. It was a wire transfer to a luxury real estate agency in Marbella, Spain. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk, the desk I had bought him for his 30th birthday. My skin went cold, then hot, a prickly sensation spreading down my arms. He wasn't just working abroad, he was building a life that didn't include a drafty Victorian house, a tired wife, or even, apparently, his own parents. I looked at the clock. It was 3:45 a.m. upstairs. The floorboards creaked. Elena was getting up for her nightly glass of warm milk. For 4 years, I had been the one to leave that milk on the counter for her. I had been the one to make sure the house was heated to exactly 72 degrees because Victor's bones were brittle. I had been the one working myself into an early grave to fund a man who was currently shopping for villas in Spain with my life savings. A cold, sharp clarity began to settle over me. It wasn't the heat of anger. It was the ice of a total systemic shutdown of my former self. I closed the laptop, the click of the lid sounding like a gavel. I wasn't the anchor of this family anymore. I was the storm. Looking back, the warning signs weren't just red flags. They were sirens screaming in the dark that I chose to ignore because I was too exhausted to listen. For the last 6 months, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from uncomfortable to predatory. Elena had stopped asking for permission to change things. She had started giving orders. It began with the minor things, rearranging my grandmother's china because it gathered too much dust in the light, or replacing my linen curtains with heavy, suffocating velvet drapes she'd ordered on my credit card. "Mark told me I should make myself at home, Sarah," she'd say, her voice like sandpaper on silk whenever I tried to protest. "He says you're so busy with your little drawings and blueprints that you don't have time to be a real housewife. Someone has to maintain the standards of this family." Then there were the questions, sharp, probing questions about the house title and the insurance policies. One evening, as I was slumped at the kitchen table trying to finish a site report, Elena sat across from me, sipping her tea. "You know, Victor was saying that a house this size is quite a liability for a woman on her own," she remarked, her eyes fixed on the deed box I kept on the high shelf in the pantry. "If something were to happen to you, or if the taxes became too much, it would be much safer if the property was in Mark's name alone. For the sake of the family legacy, of course. Men have a better head for these legalities." I remember laughing, a tired, hollow sound. "The house is in both our names, Elena, and I'm the one paying the taxes. I think my head for legalities is doing just fine." She didn't smile back. Her gaze went cold, a look of calculation crossing her face that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Mark mentioned he was looking into some financial restructures," she said softly. "He has big plans, Sarah, plans that require flexibility." I had brushed it off as the ramblings of a woman who wanted her son to be more successful than he was. I had even apologized to Mark about it during one of our brief, glitchy Skype calls. He had been sitting on a balcony somewhere. The background was blurred. A trick of the software, he said, was for security. And he had just smiled that charming, lopsided smile of his. "You know how Mom is, babe. She just worries. She wants us to be secure. Don't let it get to you. Focus on the project, okay? I'm doing this all for us." Us. That word had been my anchor. But as I sat in the darkness of his study now, the bank's zero-balance screen still burned into my retinas. The word felt like a noose. The physical reaction hit me then, a delayed explosion of grief and terror. My lungs felt like they were filling with sand. I couldn't draw a full breath. I stood up, but my knees buckled, and I had to grab the edge of the heavy oak desk to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The room began to spin, the shadows stretching and warping until the walls felt like they were closing in. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, and a sharp, metallic taste filled my mouth. My heart wasn't just beating, it was thundering, a frantic, trapped animal hitting the bars of its cage. He took it all, I thought. Every cent I saved for the restoration, the emergency fund for my own health, the money my father left me. But the bank transfer to Marbella wasn't the end of it. My architect's brain, trained to look for structural weaknesses, told me there was more. I looked at the middle drawer of the desk. Mark had always kept it locked, claiming it held sensitive corporate data from his London firm. I had never touched it, out of a misplaced sense of respect for his privacy. That respect died at 4 a.m. I went to the kitchen, my movements jerky and mechanical, like a puppet with frayed strings. I found the spare key hidden inside a decorative tin of loose-leaf tea, a place Mark thought was clever. I walked back to the study, the silence of the house feeling heavy and ominous, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The lock clicked open with a sickeningly smooth sound. Inside wasn't corporate data. There were no project reports or consulting contracts. Instead, there was a thick, blue expansion folder. My hands were shaking so violently that I nearly dropped it. I spilled the contents onto the desk. The first thing I saw was a glossy brochure for the Azure residences in Marbella. It was a picture of the exact balcony I had seen on our last Skype call, the one he'd blurred out. There were photos of a penthouse suite, a shimmering infinity pool, and a woman who wasn't me, laughing as she held a glass of champagne. She was younger, blonde, and wearing a diamond necklace that probably cost more than my car. But that wasn't the point of no return. Beneath the brochure was a legal document, stamped and notarized 3 weeks ago. It was a sales agreement for my house, the Victorian estate I had bled for. Mark had used a forged power of attorney, one that claimed I was mentally incapacitated and unable to manage my affairs, to put the house on the market. The closing date was set for the end of the month. The buyer was a holding company based in the Cayman Islands, and the witnesses who had signed the forged document, Victor and Elena. I stared at their signatures, Elena's sharp, elegant cursive, and Victor's shaky, labored script. They hadn't just been staying with me. They had been acting as a cleaning crew, scrubbing my life away from the inside out while I worked myself to exhaustion to feed them. They weren't my family. They were the advance team for my husband's desertion. The nausea finally won. I stumbled to the small bathroom off the hall and retched, my body shaking with the force of the betrayal. I stayed there on the cold tile floor for a long time, the smell of Elena's expensive lavender soap, the soap I had paid for, filling my nostrils. The woman who had walked into this house 7 years ago, full of love and architectural dreams, was gone. In her place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who felt nothing but a cold, crystalline rage. The clock in the hall chimed 5 a.m. In an hour, Elena would be awake, demanding her tea and complaining about the chill in the house. In an hour, they would look me in the eye and pretend they weren't planning to throw me onto the street in 3 weeks. I stood up and washed my face with ice-cold water. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my skin pale, but the trembling had stopped. The heat of my life had been extinguished, leaving behind something much harder. I walked back to the study, picked up my phone, and opened my banking app. Mark had drained the savings, yes, but he had forgotten one thing. The primary credit card, the one with the massive limit that he used for his international travel and entertaining, was still technically in my name as the primary account holder. I had given him a secondary card 5 years ago. With 3 taps, I reported his card as stolen and froze all associated credit lines. Then I sat down at the desk and began to draft an email to the best divorce attorney in the state, a woman I had designed a home for 2 years ago. The subject line was simple: emergency, assets stolen, fraud in progress. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting a long red glow across the room. I heard the floorboards creak upstairs. Elena was awake. I didn't hide the folder. I didn't close the laptop. I sat there in Mark's chair, waiting for the woman who had helped steal my life to come down and ask for her breakfast. The long wait was over. The hunt had begun. The smell of brewing Earl Grey usually signaled the start of my day, a small comfort before the grind. But this morning, as the kettle whistled, the sound felt like a police siren. I didn't move to pour the tea. I sat at the kitchen island, the blue expansion folder splayed open like a dissected corpse on the marble countertop. I watched the doorway, my hands wrapped around a cold mug, waiting for the performance to begin. Elena appeared at exactly 6:15 a.m., wearing a silk robe I'd bought her for Christmas. She stopped short, her eyes flickering from me to the empty stove, then to the documents on the island. She didn't look guilty. She looked annoyed, as if I were a servant who had forgotten her place. "The kettle is screaming, Sarah," she said, her voice sharp. "And why are you sitting there in the dark? You look like a ghost." "I am a ghost, Elena," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears, flat and hollow. "I'm the ghost of the woman who spent 4 years paying for your surgeries, your organic groceries, and your son's delusions. But I've decided to stop haunting this house and start owning it again." I slid the forged power of attorney across the marble. It came to a stop right against her manicured hand. Her eyes darted down, and for a split second, I saw a flash of genuine fear, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, condescending sneer. "Mark told me you might have a breakdown," she said, pulling the robe tighter around her. "He said the stress of your job was making you paranoid. That's why we had to take these precautions, Sarah. You aren't well. A woman in your state shouldn't be burdened with the weight of an estate like this." "Precautions?" I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor like a bone breaking. "You forged my signature. You and Victor signed as witnesses to a lie that claims I'm mentally unfit. You're trying to sell my home to fund a life for Mark and his... Who is she, Elena? Who is the blonde in Marbella?" Elena didn't flinch. She walked over to the kettle, turned it off, and finally looked me in the eye. "Her name is Clara. She's the daughter of one of Mark's associates. She's young, she's vibrant, and most importantly, she understands how to support a man's ego, not just his bank account. Mark has been miserable for years, Sarah. You made him feel like a guest in his own life. You were always too busy, too successful, too loud." The cruelty of it was a physical blow, a sharp pain behind my ribs. I was loud because I was the only one working. I built this life for us. "You built a monument to yourself," she spat, her face contorting into a mask of pure venom. "And now it's over. The papers are signed. The house is sold. You have 2 weeks to vacate. If you try to fight this, we have the medical reports. I have recordings of your outbursts over the last few months. Who do you think the police will believe? A hardworking, elderly couple who just want to care for their son's property, or a woman who has clearly lost her grip on reality?" That was the first twist. She'd been recording me. Every time I had cried from exhaustion, every time I had lost my temper, because she'd ruined a piece of my work, she had been building a dossier to prove I was unstable. Just then, my phone began to vibrate on the counter. The caller ID showed a London number. It was Mark. I hit the speakerphone, my heart racing. "Sarah? Sarah, what the hell is going on?" Mark's voice was panicked, stripped of its usual smooth charm. "I'm at the hotel in Marbella trying to check out, and my card was declined. They're saying it's reported stolen. I'm standing here with clients, for God's sake. Fix it. Now." "The card isn't broken, Mark," I said, leaning over the phone. "The card is dead, just like our marriage. I know about the house. I know about Clara. And I know about the $20,000 you stole from the savings account yesterday." There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of waves and a woman's laughter in the distance. "Sarah, babe, listen," he finally stammered, his voice dropping an octave, trying to regain that old persuasive tone. "It's not what it looks like. The Marbella thing, it's an investment. For us. For our future. I had to move the money quickly or we would have lost the deal. And the house... I was going to tell you, I just wanted to surprise you with a fresh start in Spain. My parents need the sun, Sarah. It's for their health." "You forged my name, Mark," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. "You told the world I was crazy so you could steal my life." "I did what I had to do," he suddenly shouted, his facade finally cracking. "You wouldn't have agreed. You're obsessed with that house. I'm the man of this family and I'm making the decisions now. Now unblock the card. I have a deposit to pay on the villa by noon, or I lose everything." "You've already lost everything," I said. "And tell your mother to stop recording this, because it's going to sound very bad in court when I explain that you're attempting to extort me for a villa in Spain, while your parents are still living in my unstable care." Mark went silent again. This was the man I had loved. A coward who hid behind his mother's skirts and 1,000 miles of ocean. "Mom," he whispered into the phone. "Mom, do something. She's going to ruin it." Elena stepped forward, her eyes burning. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little girl," she hissed at the phone, then at me. "You think you're so smart? We've already moved the silver. We've moved the antique rugs and your father's collection of first editions to a secure location. If you don't sign the final transfer papers today, you'll never see those things again. They're already gone, Sarah. Just like your money. This was the second twist. While I had been at the office late last week, they had been systematically looting the house of its heirlooms, things that weren't just valuable, but irreplaceable. My father's books, my mother's wedding silver. "You're thieves," I whispered. "We're family." Victor's voice came from the doorway. He looked frail, leaning on his cane, but his eyes were as hard as Elena's. "And family takes what is theirs. You're an outsider, Sarah. You always were. You were just the means to an end." The three of them, Elena in front of me, Victor in the shadows, and Mark on the speakerphone, formed a tripod of betrayal. They thought they had me pinned. They thought the incapacitation lie and the stolen heirlooms would force me to crawl. But as I looked at Elena's smug face, a memory flashed in my mind, a detail from the quiet life she had forgotten. "You're right, Victor," I said, straightening my back. I felt that internal click, the ice-cold shift I'd felt earlier. I am an architect, and as an architect, I know that if the foundation is rotten, you don't try to fix it, you demolish it. I looked at the phone. "Mark, the card stays blocked. And Elena, you should have checked the pantry more carefully." "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "The deed box," I said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. "The one you've been eyeing for months. The one you saw me hide in the tea tin? That was a decoy. The real documents, the original deed, my father's will, and the actual power of attorney I signed for my lawyer 3 years ago in case of an emergency, are in a safety deposit box that requires a biometric scan. My scan." I leaned in closer to her, so close she could smell the cold tea on my breath. "And here's the best part. That holding company you're trying to sell my house to, the one in the Caymans, my lawyer just ran a check. The lead investor is a man named Julian Vane. Do you recognize that name, Mark?" Silence from the phone. "He's the man you consulted for in London," I continued. "The one who sued you for breach of contract 3 years ago. The one you still owe $500,000 to. He didn't want the house, Mark. He wanted a way to seize your assets. And you just handed him the forged proof that you own it." Mark's breath hitched. "What? No. That can't be. You were so busy trying to steal from me that you didn't realize you were being hunted by someone much bigger," I said. "You've just admitted to fraud on a recorded line, and you've handed your biggest enemy the keys to your parents' future. Now get out of my kitchen, Elena, before I call the police and tell them there are intruders in my home." I didn't wait for Elena to respond or for Mark to find his voice on the other end of the line. I walked to the front door and threw it wide open, letting the biting morning air flood the hallway, sweeping away the cloying scent of Elena's tea and lavender. The chill was a shock to the system, a bracing reminder that the world outside this house was vast and that I was no longer a prisoner within its walls. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my lawyer, Chloe, right in front of them. "Chloe, it's Sarah. It's time," I said, my voice steady, sounding more like the professional architect who commanded construction crews than the tired woman who had spent 4 years playing nurse. "File the emergency injunction. We're proceeding with the criminal charges for identity theft, forgery, and grand larceny. My husband and his parents have attempted to sell my property using a forged power of attorney. I have the documents and a recorded confession." Elena moved then, her silk robe fluttering as she tried to snatch the phone from my hand. Her face was a mask of frantic, ugly desperation. "You wouldn't! We're your family, you pathetic girl. Think of what this will do to Victor's heart. You'll be his murderer." I caught her wrist in midair. I didn't squeeze hard, but I held it with a strength born of 4 years of repressed fury. I looked her directly in the eye, and for the first time, she was the one who flinched. Victor's heart survived 4 years of watching me work myself to the bone to feed him while he plotted to leave me homeless. I think he'll survive a jail cell. Now get your things. You have 10 minutes before the police arrive to escort you out. The next hour was a whirlwind of clinical retribution. When the two patrol cars pulled into the gravel driveway, the flashing blue and red lights danced across the stained glass of the foyer. The glass I had restored, the glass they had tried to steal. Elena tried to play the victim, wailing about her unstable daughter-in-law and her husband's fragile health. But the officers weren't interested in her performance. They were interested in the notarized forgery sitting on the kitchen island and the digital trail of the $20,000 Mark had moved to Spain. The biggest blow for Elena came when the officers searched their sedan, parked in the detached garage. They found more than just clothes. They found my father's collection of first editions, my mother's wedding silver, and even the small velvet box containing my grandmother's pearls, all packed neatly into the trunk, ready to be driven away. Seeing those items being carried back into the house by a young officer felt like watching my soul being returned to me piece by piece. "I didn't know," Victor whimpered as he was helped toward a taxi I had called for them. The police didn't arrest them on the spot, but they were served with a restraining order and a summons that would keep them tied to the state for months. "Mark said it was for the best, Sarah. He said you wanted a change." "Mark says a lot of things, Victor," I said, watching them huddle in the back of the cab, "but from now on he'll be saying them to a judge." Mark called one last time as the sun reached its zenith. I answered, not out of weakness, but for the closure of a final killing blow. "Sarah, please," he sobbed. His voice was stripped of all its charm, replaced by the raw, pathetic terror of a man who had gambled everything and lost. "Julian Vane's lawyers are at the hotel. They've frozen my personal accounts here because I used the house sale as collateral for a business loan. They're saying it's fraud, Sarah. I have nowhere to go. Clara, she's gone. She took the jewelry and left this morning. If you don't unblock the card, I'll be on the street by nightfall." I stood on the wraparound porch, looking out over the garden. The daffodils were just starting to poke through the soil, resilient and bright despite the frost. "You once told me I was the anchor of this family, Mark," I said, my voice cold and clear. "But anchors aren't just for stability. They're also meant to be cut loose when the ship is sinking. You didn't just steal my money. You tried to steal my mind and my dignity. You chose a villa in Spain over the woman who built you a home. Enjoy the view, Mark. I hope it was worth the price of your soul." I hung up before he could respond and blocked his number. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had heard in 4 years. 6 months later, the old Miller estate feels like a completely different house. I stripped the heavy velvet drapes Elena had installed, letting the sunlight flood into every corner of the Victorian rooms. The smell of cabbage and medicinal liniment has been replaced by the scent of fresh cedar and the jasmine vines I planted under the windows. The legal battle was long and grueling, but with the evidence of the forgery and the financial trail, it was a landslide. Mark is currently navigating a nightmare of international fraud charges and a divorce settlement that stripped him of every asset he tried to hide. Elena and Victor are living in a tiny, one-bedroom apartment funded by their meager pensions, their family legacy reduced to a court-ordered repayment plan for the silver they tried to steal. Last night, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset cast shards of ruby and sapphire light across the hardwood floors. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel like a burden or a trap. It felt like a foundation. I am an architect after all. I know that the most beautiful structures are often the ones that have survived the worst storms. I lost 4 years to a man who didn't deserve a minute, but I gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that I can never be broken. You can rebuild a house from the ground up, but you can only rebuild a life when you finally realize that you are the one holding the blueprints, and my new design doesn't have room for anything less than the truth.